Hey, hello everyone. I apologize that we have to meet virtually, but unfortunately, due to the circumstances, this is the best we can do for this year. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do this program in person. There's my contact information, as Jeannie said, and if you have any questions, you can email me. So, and Jeannie will give you my email address as well. So what we hope to do tonight, and this is the first night of the FAFSA being open, so you're actually my first FAFSA completion workshop. So but what I'm going to try to do is give you information on how to complete the FAFSA and tell you about some available resources as you go through and complete the FAFSA. And on the bottom of this slide, we have the website for our student aid guide, which is one of our resources that we make available for families. So at the FAFSA, when you want to start completing it, you would go to the studentaid.gov website, and that's where you'll get to the free application for federal student aid. So this is a screenshot. If you go on your PC, this is what it'll look like when you go into start the FAFSA. In the FAFSA, there's some skip logic built in. So if you answer questions a certain way, it may allow you to skip subsequent questions. You have to file the FAFSA every year that you're enrolled in a post-secondary education. So you'll be doing, if you're going to a four-year college, you'll be doing this 4 times. And there again is the studentaid.gov website that you can go on, or you can use the mobile app that the Department of Ed makes available on your mobile device. However, whatever way you feel most comfortable. When you are getting into the FAFSA, here's the 3 browsers that are certified to be able to use the FAFSA on the web: Firefox, Chrome, or Safari. So make sure you're using one of them, because if you try to use something else, the pages don't display correctly and it's a lot more cumbersome. So when you sit down to do the FAFSA, and I don't know if some of you started this today, some of the documents you'll need are Social Security numbers for both student and parents, alien registration number if that applies to you, if you're an eligible non-citizen. You'll need your 2019 income tax return and W-2s if employed. So for 21-22, if you're a senior, we are using 2019 income tax return. It's called prior year. Any untaxed income that the family has, not Social Security benefits, but things like child support received or maybe workman's compensation, something like that, that has to be factored into the FAFSA as well. They'll ask for assets. So you should have any current bank statements and records of any other investment accounts that you have. So where for income tax or income purposes, we're using the 2019 information. When you're reporting assets, it's as of the day you're filling out the FAFSA. So if you leave this program tonight and start completing the FAFSA and they ask for your assets, it's what do you have today, okay? You'll need email addresses. They will ask for a student's driver license, but that is optional, so you don't have to complete that. And both the student and at least one parent will need what's called an FSA account, which was formerly called the FSA ID, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the FSA ID account, some of you may have applied for this because you could have done that before October 1st. If you haven't, I would say do this prior to completing the FAFSA. This will be your legal signature for signing the FAFSA. So the student and at least one parent have to apply for this. What you're really doing is setting up or choosing a username and password, and that is your FSA account. When you get into this process to apply for the FSA account, they're going to ask you to set up a username, a password, report your email address, your mobile phone if you have one. They'll have you answer security questions, and they'll ask for Social Security numbers. So when the student and parent are setting these up, they have to make sure they don't use the same email address or mobile phone, because it won't work. It won't let you set it up. You have to have separate email addresses and mobile phones. So when you get to studentaid.gov, which is the website to complete the FAFSA, you'll see the login, and you'll click on that. You'll then get to this screen where you can either log in as the student, where you see the red arrow, and if you say I am the student, they're going to ask you for that FSA account, the username and password. If the parent logs in on the right, the parent never wants to log in on the left, because if they put their own FSA account, it's as if they're applying for financial aid to go to school, so you don't want to do that. So you want to, if the parent wants to log in, they can go in under I am a parent, and they'll need the student's name, social security number, and date of birth. There will be a disclaimer that you'll have to accept. And then you'll make sure that you pick the right year. You want to pick the 2021-2022 FAFSA, because right now that FAFSA is available, but the FAFSA for this year that we're in right now, the 2021, is also available for students that are still applying for aid. So you want to make sure you pick the proper year. You will then have to create a save key, and that can be anything between 4 and 8 characters long, any combination of numbers, letters, uppercase, lowercase. And all that is if you sit down to do the FAFSA and you can't complete it in one sitting, you would need that save key to get back in. You just want to make sure that you complete the FAFSA within 45 days of the day you started it. Then there's some links if you have questions about how long the FAFSA takes. Can I save my FAFSA if I can't finish it? Those types of things. So if you want to learn more information about any of those topics, you can click on the links. And every time you're on a FAFSA screen, you'll see the next down the bottom, and that's how you move through the FAFSA. So then we're going to ask for student demographics. And if a student logged in with their FSA account, some of this will be pre-populated because you entered your name, social security number, all those things when you set up the FSA account. The middle initial doesn't get asked for in the FSA account, so you have to update that. And if you see the arrow up top, the student demographics, that's called the navigation bar up there, so it's going to tell you where you are in the application. They're going to ask for the student's email and phone number, and the student wants to make sure they use an email that they're looking at on a regular basis. They don't want to use a high school email address because they're not going to be using that anymore and probably won't even have access to it. Then they'll enter their address, the student. And then the question will be asked, have you lived in Pennsylvania for at least 5 years? This FAFSA form is used across the country. You don't have to have lived in Pennsylvania for 5 years to be considered for the Pennsylvania state grant, but this has to cover all states. So that's why that question is asked. And then they ask if you're a US citizen, and you would say yes, or if you have an alien registration number, you would enter that. Now, after you answer those questions, a prompt will show, which will say, you're eligible to transfer your FAFSA information into Pennsylvania state grant application. So they're kind of letting you know that when you get to the end of the application, there's a link that you can complete the state grant form. Just because a lot of times when people get to the end of the FAFSA, they forget to click on that link. So they're trying to give them a warning up front that once you're confirmed, you want to do the state grant form. Then the student answers questions about, will they have a high school diploma? What college degree will they be working on? And most times it's their first bachelor's degree. Will you already have your first bachelor's degree before you start? Now that says 2021, so that's not correct. It should be 21, 22. Unfortunately, some of the slides are not available yet, so we were kind of trying to do the best we can here, but that should say 21, 22. But that answer should be no. What will your college grade level be when you start the 21, 22 year? And you should say never attended college on first year. Then you'll be asked, are you interested in being considered for work study? That's a federal program that you're considered for when you fill out the FAFSA. And if you think you might want to work on campus, you would say yes there. Doesn't mean you're committed to working, but at least you'll be considered. They then ask the question, are you male or female? And if you check male, if a male is 18 years old, they're required to be registered for selective service. And it's the gender that was assigned at birth. I get that question a lot. So if a student clicks male, then it will say, are you registered with selective service? Now, if you haven't, you can say, it'll say, do you want us to register you? And you can say yes there. So that makes it convenient. They'll then ask for the driver's license, which I said is optional. Then they're going to ask, are you a foster youth or were you at any time in the foster care system? The reason they had asked that is if you say yes, they give you more information about different types of financial aid that are available for foster youth. And then they'll ask what the highest school completed by both parent 1 and parent 2 is. And when you start here with parent 1 and parent 2, you want to make sure you're consistent throughout the FAFSA. And unfortunately, sometimes they say parent 1, sometimes they say first parent. So I don't know why they don't keep it the same, but whoever you select as parent 1 or first parent, be consistent through the application. And this information isn't really used for anything here in Pennsylvania, but some states have aid for first generation college students, so that's why they ask this question. Okay, then the student will type in information about where they went to high school, what's the name of the high school, and what school is your high school located, or what city, and then click the search button, because we want to make sure that you typed the high school in the proper way, the way that is listed in the FAFSA database. So you'll see a screen such as this come up, and you can select Radnor. I can't think of what city you're in. I guess you're in Radnor, right? So you'll see that pop up, and you'll just select that. Then you'll have to list the colleges that you want this information to be sent to. So you're able to list 10 colleges. Now, I usually get the question, what if I'm considering more than 10 colleges? So I'll answer that for you now. What you need to do is you put 10 colleges down and submit the FAFSA. In a few days, the student will receive a student aid report, which is a summary of the FAFSA, and that means that the FAFSA has processed. Once it processed, you can go back in, you can remove a college because they've already received your information, and add another one. So that's how you would get this information to more than 10 schools. So if you know the federal school code, you can put that in. Most times people don't, so they search by state and city and then just select from a list and add their schools. And once the schools are listed, you can see this example, University of Iowa. It'll pop up and you'll just select them, and then just click the box on the bottom to add more schools. And then all the schools will populate, and for each school, you have to hit the drop-down box or the drop-down list right next to the name, and you'll say, I'm going to be on campus, off campus, or with parents. Because sometimes students are applying to schools where they would have to live on campus. Sometimes they're also applying to maybe a community college where they plan to live with parents. So for each school, you have to indicate your housing status. Then you'll answer student marital status, which 99% of the time is I am single. But this FAFSA is not only used for dependent students, but it could be used for independent students, and some of them are married, so they have to ask that question. It will ask if the student has dependents for that they provide more than one half support for between 2021 and 2022. So, and the reason these questions are asked here is to determine if that student is independent of their parents. And that will be one reason a student could be considered independent. So they ask these questions. If you answer no, you're going to move on and answer the following questions. And these, again, are also questions that are being asked to determine, is the student dependent or independent? So if none of these apply to you, you'll check none of the above. And most times, students are checking none of the above. But there could be a student that, the third one down, at any time since you turned 13, were your parents deceased, were you in foster care, or were you a dependent or ward of the court? Somebody might be able to answer yes to that and be considered independent. So just read through those questions and, check any box that applies to you. The other question that is asked to determine dependency status is, on or after July 1st, 2020, were you homeless or were you self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? So sometimes a student is determined homeless by maybe a liaison at the school, and if they are, they can also be considered independent. So after the student answers all those questions and the FAFSA looks and says, okay, based on the way they answered this, I'm considering this student a dependent student. And that circle will automatically be filled in. I will provide information about my parents. Now, if you were considered dependent based on the way you answered the questions, but there's some extenuating circumstances where, you can't provide your parents' information because of something unusual, you can say, I am unable to provide information about my parents but you will then have to contact the schools you're applying to and PHEAA to say, here's my situation. And they'll have to look at your documentation to determine if they'll consider you independent. So it's really up to the schools and up to PHEAA to determine that. But most students will say, I'll provide information about my parents and then move on to the parent section. So then they're going to start asking information about the parents, and you have to indicate marital status. And that's of the parents that the student has lived with the most over the previous 12 months. So if the parents are married, you'll be listing their information. If the parents are divorced or separated, you would be listing the information for the parent with whom the student lived more than 50% with over the past 12 months. I know that's a mouthful, but the instructions are right there in the FAFSA. And the question marks at the end of every line, if you click on that question mark, it will say just what I just said, if you're not sure whose information to put down. So for every line, it gives you a little more information. But say the parents are divorced and the student lives more with the mother. It would be the mother's information, and if that mother remarried, it would be the step-parent's information as well. And this is more information about the parent. So this is where it says your first parent, and that's what I said. Sometimes they use parent one, sometimes they use first parent. So you want to kind of be consistent with that. So they're asking for demographic information about the parent. And then they ask about the other parent or parent two. And then they'll ask the same question about the parent. Has the parent, have they lived in Pennsylvania for at least 5 years? Then we get into where they're asking how many people are in your household size. So it will automatically pull over that first line there where it says your parents. If they said they're married, it's automatically going to pull 2 over. They're going to put 1 in for you, the student. And then the next line, it will say, do your parents have other children, even if they do not live with them, that they provide more than half of their support? So if they do, if you have siblings, you would list them there. And then if there's other people that live in the household that the parents provide more than half support, they list them on the next line. So then they'll add them up in the gray box, and that's the other people. So then you'll, in this case, they have the 2 parents and the 1 student. So that totaled 3. So it'll automatically total for the family. And then the number in college is how many people will be in college at the same time on at least a half-time basis during 21-22. And you can't include parents there if they're in college. It's just siblings and the student. So then they start asking about parents' tax filing status, whether you already completed it, which most people are going to have completed their 2009 income tax return. They also want to know what type of income tax return you completed and what was your tax return filing status. So you'll complete that, and then it will say, do you want to link to the IRS? So I would encourage you to do this because this, and I'm going to take you through the screens, but you click on link to the IRS and it brings you over, it will say parents leaving the FAFSA. That's the first graphic on the left-hand side. It will take you over and you'll say, you're now leaving the IRS. Click OK if you want to do that. So you do that and you'll have to enter the FSA account for the parent. And then it will say you're in the government, US government system, and you're getting right to the IRS. And this is the screen that will be presented to the parent. The parent then has to enter some information such as the address, and you want to make sure that you enter that the same way as it shows up on the tax return, because if it doesn't match, they won't let you use the tool. And then you'll hit submit. And then you put in, you click the box that says you want to transfer your information into the FAFSA form and click on transfer now. And then the information will come over and you'll see where this red star is. It says transferred from the IRS. So the income tax information is automatically going to be transferred over. So you'll see there that you don't see a number for adjusted gross income. You just see the wording transferred. So it doesn't actually show you the numbers. It's encrypted, but you know that the information was transferred over from the IRS. Now, if you don't use the IRS, if you choose not to, or you can, and there's some situations where families can't use the IRS data retrieval tool To give you an example, if the parents are married, but they choose to file their tax returns separately, the tool can't bring two tax returns over. So the parents would have to add those two tax returns together and manually enter the information. So these screens are just showing you, if you didn't use the IRS DRT, you're going to have to manually enter information. And you can see this is the line that asks for parents' adjusted gross income for 2019, and it will tell you the exact line to pull that from. And in this case, it's the 1040 line 8B. So it tells you exactly where to pull it from. And again, you can click on the question mark to get any more instruction that you need for each line. Now this will be asked of everybody. It's how much did your parent 1 and parent 2 earn from work? Even if you pulled the information over from the IRS, if you can picture the tax return, it will have your adjusted gross income, but it doesn't say this amount is contributed to the mom and this amount's contributed to the dad. So if you have both parents are working, you're going to have to manually enter the income earned from work. So it's important to have that W-2, Schedule 1, and if you have a Schedule K1 available so you can get that number. And a lot of times when I do FAFSA completion sessions in person, people don't have the W-2s with them for some reason. So you need that when you're sitting down. And this is an example of a W-2, and that's where you would take the income earned from work, that box 1. Then they'll ask for the amount of income tax you paid. And again, it tells you, take it from line 1040, line 14, minus Schedule 2, line 2. And this always gets everybody confused, but here's an example. Here's the line 14. You would take that, and if you have anything on line 2 of Schedule 2, you would deduct that from the amount on line 14. So it seems a little convoluted, but if you just follow what the question is asking you, you should be okay. And then there's a bunch of information for tax filers only. They'll ask, well, did you have combat pay? I don't think I've ever helped anybody that said they had combat pay, but you know, that's asked for there. If there's any student college grant scholarship aid that was reported to the IRS, they'd want that information. Education credits, and some of this is pulled over for you from the IRS if you use the IRS data retrieval tool. So most of this information that you see a line item on the 1040, that's already being brought over with the IRS DRT. Then they ask some questions because they're looking at income coming in, but then they're saying, well, maybe this family's paying child support out. So they want to deduct that out of what's available to them. So they'll say, did your parent pay any child support because of divorce or separation? You put that amount in, and that's a yearly amount. Did your parents have earnings from a co-op program offered by a college? Did they have taxable earnings from any need-based employment programs, like that work-study program I talked about? If anybody earns money from that work-study program and they list it here, they deduct that out of their earnings because it's a federal program. And then they'll ask for parent untaxed income. So you'll see, as I mentioned, if they receive child support payments, and then there's housing, food, and other living allowances paid to members of the military, clergy, and others. So they'll ask for that. The third one where the arrow is, that's always one that a lot of people seem to miss. If you made payments to a tax-deferred pension plan, you can see that on your W-2, and I have an example on the next slide, but they'll tell you the exact box and code that you'd have to report. And then, and again, you do not include untaxed Social Security benefits or SSI. So here's the W-2, and in this case, this person has something on 12A, and the code is D, so that $1,500 has to be reported as untaxed income. And then we get into parents' assets. So they're saying, do you want to skip the questions about your assets? What will come before this, but I didn't have an example of one of these slides. It's going to, because of that skip logic, based on the way the parents answered the questions, it will say, do your assets exceed this amount? And that amount's going to be different for everybody. If it doesn't exceed that amount, you can skip the assets. If it does exceed that amount, you have to list your assets. So in that first line, they want to know, as of today, what is your parents' total current balance of cash, savings, and checking accounts? The second line is, as of today, what is the net worth of your parents' investments, including real estate, but not their primary residence? So examples of that, as you see on the left, could be things like you have 529 plans for your students, or you have CDs, bonds, money market funds, stock options, those types of things. So if you have anything like that, you have to report it. Say you have a shore house, you would take the value of the shore house minus what you owe on that, and the difference would be an asset. And then the third line is asking, as of today, what is the net worth of the parents' current business and or investment forms? And it will tell you that a business value does not include a family business if the family owns and controls more than 50% of the business and has 100 or less full-time employees. So, and I would suggest when you get to the investments to click on the question mark and scroll down, because sometimes I haven't been on the FAFSA this year, but sometimes the 529, you don't see it until you scroll down, and people say to me, I never saw where I had a list of 529. So just look through those assets carefully, because it will tell you exactly what they want you to list and what not to list. And then they go through student information. It's going to be the same thing as the parent, so I'll kind of, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the same thing, they're going to ask if the student filed a tax return, what kind of tax return. They can link to the IRS and pull it over just like the parents could. So they would do that. If they don't want to bring it over from the IRS data retrieval tool, they'll have to manually enter the information just as the parents would, and how much they earn from work if they earned money from work. Okay. The amount of their federal income tax for 2019. And then all these same questions I showed you for the parents will be asked of the student. And probably a lot of these questions for the student are going to wind up being 0. So most of the time they're not paying child support out and those kinds of things. But not as a freshman, but when you apply next year, a student may have worked under the federal work study program. So in that third line, if the student did earn any federal work study funds, they want to list them there so that they're not taken out into consideration. And this is the same again as for the parents, child support received, all those types of things. Then they'll ask for student assets. So the student has to list anything they have in their name. Cash, savings, and checking, if they have any investments, if they have a business and farm. A lot of times that really doesn't apply to a student, but they do have to list that if they have anything such as that. Now, when you get towards the end, it's going to say, are you a preparer? And it says, this is rare. Parents are not preparers. This is if you're paying somebody to fill out the FAFSA. So pretty much most of the time, the answer here is no. And then the signatures are going to be needed. So this is where you're going to use that FSA account where it says provide student signature. You're going to click on that link and you'll have to hit agree and then click on sign the FAFSA for the student. And you'll get to this page where you can see under the student, it says signed electronically because you use that FSA account. And then you'll do the same thing for the parent. You'll click on provide parent signature. Now you have to pick parent 1 or parent 2 who applied for the FSA account. So you want to pick that person to sign the FAFSA. And then again, they hit agree and sign the FAFSA. Now, if you don't want to sign the FAFSA with the FSA account, you should do it if you have an FSA account. But if you can, and I'll give you an example, if there's a student is a citizen or an eligible non-citizen and the parent's undocumented, they have to list all zeros for their social security number, the parent. So they can't apply for an FSA account because you need social security number. So you can actually print out a signature page and sign it and mail it in. So that's why they give you other options to sign the FAFSA. So then it will say, in this case, both parent and student signed electronically. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that you're at that confirmation page. And remember in the beginning when it said you might be able to do the state grant form? Well, where we have the red box on that link, it says start your state application, apply for it. Now that says Iowa. That's because the demo screens that the Department of Ed gave us say Iowa, so I have to change that. I'm looking at like 3 things already I have to change. As I said, you guys are the guinea pigs. But anyway, we'll say Pennsylvania because they'll know that you're from Pennsylvania. You'll click on that and you'll go right to the Pennsylvania state grant form. To the right of that, if a parent has 2 children that they're applying for financial aid for, they both have to file FAFSAs. So they can click on that link to transfer the parent information over to that second student. So that makes it nice because all the parent information will populate on the second student's FAFSA, and then the student will just have to enter their information. So the result of all this information that you put on the FAFSA is something called an expected family contribution. So you see at the top right hand of that slide, in this case, this student's family contribution is estimated to be $25.92. So the schools that the student is sending this information to will look at their cost of attendance, subtract this expected family contribution, and that's how they determine if the student has financial need. That EFC is going to stay the same no matter what school they attend. Okay. And then whatever schools you listed there will have some comparison information. They'll have graduation rate, retention rate, transfer rate. So you can take a look at that. And this is the screen you'll get to if you click on that link to complete the Pennsylvania state grant. And the reason we need that, because a lot of people say, why do you need another form? There's pieces of information that we need to determine your eligibility for Pennsylvania state grant that aren't asked for on the FAFSA. And one is enrollment status. They never ask what your enrollment status is. And if you're full-time versus part-time, that makes a difference in your state grant amount. So what happens next? The student completes the FAFSA. All the schools that the student listed on the FAFSA receive the results and they determine eligibility for financial aid. And then they send out financial aid notifications to the students. And that's how they determine, they'll start comparing those notifications to see, you know, what makes the most sense for their family. I know this is a FAFSA session, but I just want to mention here, in addition to the FAFSA, some schools will require additional applications. They might ask for something called a CSS profile through College Board. So you want to find out from your schools if they're asking for those additional applications. The FAFSA is free, the CSS profile form is not. And I will tell you that the CSS profile form asks for a lot of additional information than what the FAFSA asks for. So I mentioned a couple times that for 21-22, you're reporting 2019 income information. And this slide really is kind of important this year because if there's some special circumstances since 2019 where you have reduced income or the parent has reduced income, it could have been because they lost a job. And with all this pandemic, that's happened. Somebody might have unusual medical expenses or something. Anything like that, any unusual expenses or reduced income, you should report to the schools that you're applying to and PHEAA, because they can look at that, ask you for some supporting documentation, and possibly use that. And it's really up to them. They can use their professional judgment to determine if they'll use the more recent information. So just to wrap things up, you want to make sure you submit your FAFSA prior to the school deadline. I'm not sure if I mentioned that in the beginning, but every school will have their own deadline for the FAFSA. Look for scholarships because you want to exhaust all free sources of financial aid before you take loans. Make sure you look at the costs at the college and understand them, and then compare all those financial aid offers and see, as I said, what makes most sense so that you're thinking about your future. If it's a high cost institution, I have to take a lot of loans. Is that something you want to do? You have to decide that. So I'll put my contact information up here again. That was a lot. Sorry. But that's kind of the overview of the FAFSA.
Great. Fran, I do have some questions if you're ready for those too.
Sure.
All right. A couple of things I wanted to say. I had a printed copy of the tips and reminders that you had sent earlier and that we had pushed out to students and parents before this event. I followed that through your presentation. That couldn't be more helpful. That was amazing. So thank you.
Okay, great. Great, thank
and then
you.
one other thought is that question mark. I just remember from last year using that question mark so many times for clarification. It was often overlooked when you're completing the FAFSA. So that question mark is super, super helpful. So questions we've had along the way, the FSA IDs. What do I do if I have 2 children in college?
Okay, so if you have 2 children, you as the parent only have to apply for one FSA ID as the parent, but each student has to apply for their own FSA ID. Okay? Because you can use your FSA ID to sign both students' FAFSA, but they need their own because they also have to sign the FAFSA as a student.
Great. Is the yes just for U.S. citizens for selective service? So do you have to choose yes or only if you're a U.S. citizen?
Every student has to. If you're not a U.S. citizen, you're not going to be eligible for financial aid. So if you say you're not a U.S. citizen, your FAFSA won't get processed. You either have to be a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen, providing that alien registration number, and they all have to say they're registered for the draft.
Okay. What if parents have 50-50 custody?
Okay, so if the student lives with mom half the time and the father the other half the time, they have to come up with some way to determine who provides 51% of the support. So that's kind of a call, the parents have to make that call and determine who's going to fill out the FAFSA. So,
and when you say support, you mean financial support?
Yes, financial. Because if they live 50-50, that's the first rule that you look at. Who do they live with more than 50%? But if it's exactly 50% that they live with mom and dad, they have to get together and say, okay, who provides more than 50% of the financial support for that student?
Great. Next question. What if parents have never done taxes in the U.S. because they've only been here for a few months?
Okay, so if they haven't done taxes, they would check do not file. But then under income earned from work, they would have to, for 2019, if they earned income in another country, they'd have to figure out what they earned and list that under income earned from work. Because not everybody files a tax return, or in this situation, like you said, they've only been here a few months. They would just kind of have to figure out, and they would convert that into American dollars, whatever country they worked in. They may get asked, if it's a substantial amount, a college might say, why didn't you file taxes? And they can just explain themselves. Well, I wasn't in the country, I earned it in another.
Great. How do you deal with foreign income with no W-2 statements? I think you covered some of that already.
Yeah, well, if it's income earned from work, I'm just trying to think. I would just estimate to the best of your ability what you earned if you don't have a W-2 and put it in that income earned from work. And that's really, they're using those numbers because they have that 2-parent working household allowance that they allow. So try to just estimate the best you can.
Great. We may get FAFSA results before students are admitted to their college, correct?
No, the student will get a student aid report, which is a summary of everything you put in the FAFSA, but they will not get any financial aid if that's what you're thinking prior to getting accepted to the college. You can send the FAFSA to any college, and even if you're not accepted, but they're not actually going to award you federal and state aid and most of the time institutional aid until you're accepted. So you will get results, you'll get the student aid report, which is a summary, but you won't actually get an award notification with amounts on it until you're accepted.
You will get the EFC, correct?
Yeah, you'll get the EFC, yes.
Yeah.
You'll actually get the EFC the minute you hit submit on the FAFSA on that, when you see it, I showed you that confirmation page, you'll see the EFC will automatically calculate.
Okay. Can you submit the FAFSA before you apply to schools?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, you can.
All right, and then we've got a few more that I didn't write down. Let me see if I can catch up with those. Would we contact financial aid office regarding special circumstances after the student is accepted?
I mean, you can do it either way as long as you've made an application, because I feel that if you didn't make an application, they're not going to do much with it. But if the student made application and you filled out the FAFSA and you know that there's a reduced income, you can contact the school and they can start gathering the documentation they need, because, you know, sometimes they want, you know, they'll want recent pay stubs, the reason, you know, did you get let go of your job? What happened? All those kinds of things. So it's best to get all that information together early so they can come up with a package for you early.
Great. Next question. I have heard that even if you don't think you will qualify for need-based aid, that you should fill out the FAFSA. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Okay, I always tell everybody to fill out the FAFSA. Well, some schools will require it, even for merit-based aid. So you want to find out if your school's requiring it. The other thing is, if you want to take a federal, if the student wants to take a federal student loan or the parent wants to take a federal Parent Plus loan, a FAFSA has to be filed. So I'd say fill it out, because, you know, even if you think you don't need a loan and halfway through the semester you think, oh, I do, you don't have that FAFSA on file. Or something could happen where there's a reduction in income and you don't have that original FAFSA, so you have to start from scratch. So I think it's a good idea to get the FAFSA filed.
Great. If you have multiple children in college, will the EFC be the same for each child?
Not necessarily, because what happens with the EFC is there's a parent contribution calculated and a student contribution calculated. So the parent contribution is divided into how many kids are in college at the same time. So the parent contribution piece would be the same for each student, but then they add that to the student contribution, and students might have different earnings or different assets. So the actual EFC might not be the same for everybody, unless, say, all three students had zero income and zero assets, then it would be the same.
Great. And here's one looking for some clarification. If both spouses have lost jobs due to COVID, do they need to contact each college separately? And do they need to do that by the deadline for each college? I would assume that's a financial aid deadline and not an application deadline.
Yeah, I'm assuming they mean financial aid deadline. I would assume they want that information by the deadline, but yes, you do have to let each college know, because as I said, it's called professional judgment, and one college could look at it differently than another college does. So, and they usually each have something called maybe a special condition form or something like that, where they'll have you complete it saying, what do you think your income's going to be for this year as opposed to 2019? You know, maybe provide us some documentation. So you do have to contact each college.
Yep. Next question. What if the parent with less custody has remarried? Does that account for both incomes in that household versus custody household?
Okay, not sure how they're defining custody, but here's what I'll say about that. The first thing the family does is say, who did the student live with more than 50%? So if it's the mom, and that's what they mean by custody, and that mom has remarried, yes, the step parent's information gets listed. Okay?
Yeah.
So hopefully that answered that question.
If it didn't, whoever posted the question, chop back in. If the student lives primarily with the mother and the mother makes less money, but the father wants to pay more than the mother.
It's like I said, if they primarily live with the mother, they have to put the mother's information. So, you know, that's great. You know, I know people are just trying to be honest and fill them out correctly. But it's actually whoever they live with more than 50%. So if it's with the mother, that's the information they're listing.
I just started working. Do I include my income? I did not work in 2019.
No, for the FAFSA, you only list the income information for 2019. Now, if it's zero, a school may say, how did you support yourself? And maybe it was, maybe the other parent was working, who knows what the situation is. But they only list 2019.
Since it is recommended that everyone submit a FAFSA, does that mean when college applications ask, are you applying for financial aid, we should say yes, even if we don't think we will qualify for need-based aid?
That's more of an admissions thing. I don't, I mean, I know some people worry about that hurting them. I don't know how every school looks at that, to be honest with you. But I mean, if you're filling the FAFSA out, I would say yes to that, but I don't want to tell you something that might hurt you on the admission side. I don't, you might know more about that than me. I don't have an answer for that, sorry.
Yeah, I think it probably would be a question to ask admissions directly, especially under these circumstances when the financial status of many colleges is uncertain. That may be a good question directly for the admissions office. Next question, does the FAFSA application address have to match the student school application address?
When you say the student's school, I'm not sure what they mean by that. The address that they put on the FAFSA, does it have to match the address they used in high school? Not really. I mean, they will, whatever address they're living in is what they should put down. I'm not sure. Maybe if they can give a little more clarification what they're looking for.
Yep.
There is a student address that shows on a student's transcript, right? And I guess potentially they're concerned about a conflict between that. But when we send that form, it's just sent as a PDF, and they're going to identify whatever address you list in your application as your primary. So if there's a conflict between those two things, I don't imagine that creating any issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
And this is in reference to the prior question where we asked for more clarification. I was referring to kids with mother 90% of the time, fathers remarried. Do both his and wife's, meaning the stepmother's, income matter? Also, stepdaughter with me and wife 50% of time. Our combined income is greater than the ex-husband's. How does that work?
Whoa, that was a lot. Okay,
that
so
may
the
be
student,
one he could reach out to you directly through email and get some clarification on that parent.
yeah, because I want to make sure I answer that correctly. I mean, if the student is living with the mom 90% of the time, that's the information that's going on the FAFSA with the step parent, if there is a step parent. If they have a stepdaughter living with them, they can list that stepdaughter and household size as long as they're saying that they provide more than 1/2 support. If they're paying child support, let's say if they're receiving child support for that stepdaughter, that would be considered untaxed income. So if that doesn't answer your question, you can email me and I'll try to help you out.
Right. And going back to the address of the student where they're applying and assuming as sort of their college residency as far as getting their acceptance letters or information communication from colleges, if that address is different than the address that they are using for the FAFSA, does that complicate things? Or
I guess I'm just not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure why they would have two different addresses, one for admissions and one for FAFSA. So I hesitate to answer that. I think if that person emails me, I mean, I'm not going to be able to give them information on what a college does as far as determining if it's a residency status thing. Like if they're thinking it's an out-of-state address trying to get residency, I can't help them with that if that's the question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I suspect that the question has more to do with in one household, they're managing the applications and kind of, being task oriented and getting things done. So they're using that address. And the other address, maybe the one that could be tied to financial aid, or the parent who is applying
Yeah.
for financial aid.
yeah, whoever's applying for financial aid, wherever that student's living, should be the address on the FAFSA. And even if somebody else is doing the admissions application, I would try to keep that the same.
Okay.
Even if somebody else is doing the work, I don't think I would mix the addresses.
Okay. And one more question. We are not US citizens yet. Can we apply?
Okay, if the student is not a US citizen, no, they cannot apply. If the student is and the parents are not, the student can apply. So, the parents would just put zeros in the social security number area. They'd have to print and sign and print the signature page and mail it in. But the student can apply for federal aid. They may not be eligible for a state grant because there's a domicile requirement. And if the student's under 18, they look at how long the parent's been here. And if this parent's not a citizen, that won't be counted towards the domicile requirement.
Got it.
And no, that's kind of convoluted, but.
Yeah. I think that, what about green cards?
That should have your alien registration number on it because you're an eligible non-citizen. So you just list that on the FAFSA and you would be eligible for financial aid.
Terrific. All right, I think that concludes questions. We are recording this and we'll take a look at what the end product looks like, and if it is quality enough, well enough, we will post it on our school counseling website. We do have the tip guide, the tips and reminders that you receive through email. That is already posted on our website. And then we'll have Fran's PowerPoint as well posted on the website. Probably give us till mid-morning and then you'll have access to that as well. Fran, I want to thank you for this great information, this thorough information, and taking the time to meet with our families and share your expertise. Again, Fran's email is posted in the chat room. We appreciate everybody coming out tonight, and Fran, appreciate you so much and grateful to have you on part of the Radnor team.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much, and good night.